Welcome to part three of the Working Constitution. We're looking at our four cornerstones or guiding principles that allow for the framers of the Constitution to have created a strong central government while at the same time limiting the government's power and protecting people's rights. First video, we looked at the concept of federalism between state and federal government in terms of powers they share, powers they have over each other, that sort of thing. Second video, we looked at separation of powers, our three branches, looked at some ways they might check and balance each other out. And today we're going to look at constitutional flexibility. Going to look at how the Constitution has room for change if we need it. And then the next and last video, we'll look at equal rights in this series and wrap up our four principles or cornerstones of the Constitution series. So, constitutional flexibility, you see the word flexible, you should think of something that bends. It's really the ability of the Constitution to adapt or change to times to the changing needs of the country. There's this understanding that there might be changes in the laws as we move forward. Technology is going to change that. Attitudes might change over time, and we have to be able to adapt to that. So there's really kind of three ways in which we exercise flexibility through the mechanism of the Constitution. The first is really the formal way. We actually can change it through something called the amendment process. And the amendment process is where we actually tag on a change to the Constitution. You may remember our first 10 were called the Bill of Rights. We're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. In fact, those first 10 amendments had to happen in order for the Anti-Federalists to approve the Constitution. And while it can be changed, it's also not easy to change it. You need 2/3 of both the House and the Senate to approve it, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the state amendment conventions would decide if they want to make an amendment. So it's a pretty complicated process, but it's possible. And one way to look at it is the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were created in the early 1790s. And since then, we've only had 17 more. We have 27 total. So in over 200 years, we've only created 17 amendments, two of which at least cancel each other out. So we'll be looking at those amendments later. So when we get to amendments later, they're really a big deal. So you're going to want to pay attention to some of the ones we really focus on. Second is far more informal, that in Clause 18 in Article 1 of the Constitution, it states that Congress can make laws necessary and proper. And this little clause, this little chunk of words we call the elastic clause. It's that idea that Congress is going to make laws that kind of match the times. So for example, in recent years, a number of laws have been made dealing with our use of technology and social media, trying to protect people from things like cyberbullying and from online scams. Those were not issues years ago because we didn't have that technology. But since then, Congress has had to make laws to deal with that. So when we look at Congress making laws throughout the year, we should think elastic clause. And we're going to look at some pretty important laws throughout our nation's history. Thirdly, the court system has something called judicial review, where the Supreme Court can review laws, meaning look them over, and decide if the law is unconstitutional. So it's a way for the Supreme Court to check Congress and check the president, but more importantly, that kind of changes the nature of things. So we're going to be looking at a number of Supreme Court cases this year, some of which definitely show up in the Regents exam for good reason. They really changed the way we had to write laws. They changed what certain things meant. And so we're going to look at some really key, what we call landmark cases that really changed things in terms of people's voting rights, in terms of people, where do you go to school, all kinds of things. So keep those things in mind as we move forward and think about examples of flexibility as we look at historic events throughout the course.